This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Fortress America. Fortress America was first released in 1986 by Milton Bradley as part of their Game Master series. Fortress America was designed by Michael Gray and takes about 3 hours to play. Fortress America was re-released in 2012 by Fantasy Flight Games. This new version includes new sculpts for the miniatures, new art for the game board and components, and an extra set of rules for the invaders. Fortress America represents the pinnacle of Cold War American paranoia translated into an area control game. Now, let's go back to a more simple-minded time. Imagine a nightmare future where America is betrayed by her former allies. One lucky player assumes the role of America, caught off guard by a cowardly sneak attack by just about everyone else in the world, except the Canadians who apologized and bowed out. Hockey season. The 3 other players need to work fast to sweep inward and conquer states as fast as possible, because as Hollywood has taught the world, may take Americans a while to get going, but once they get riled up, there's gonna be hell to pay. If America fails, her citizens will live under brutal foreign masters and suffer unspeakable horrors, such as no longer being allowed to have ice in their drinks, learning more than one language, and being forced to use the metric system. With stakes this high, America can't fail. So if you want to experience the ultimate Ameritrash nightmare, stick around. Because we're going to learn to play Fortress America. Alright people, get your bits together. It's time to set up the game. This is the original 1986 version of the game board. To be honest, I love the 80s aesthetic, the vibrant colors, the clear contrast between the various terrain and borders. It's a good looking board. I grew up during the 80s, so I might be a little biased. However, for this tutorial, we're going to use the newer version of Fortress America from Fantasy Flight Games. This is the 2012 version of the Fortress America map. This version aspires for the Partisan field kit look with sweaty creases, oily smudges, shell casings, and a compass. Besides the difference in art style, the actual board is nearly the same with only a few tweaks to resources in certain states. Fantasy Flight has also added modern score tracks at the top of the board. These are not essential to playing the game, but sure are a nice convenience feature. So, if you only have the Classic Edition, you should still be able to follow along with no problem until we reach the new variant rules for the invaders. These new rules are optional, but only available in the newer version of the game. So, with all that said, let's set up Fortress America. So now that we've decided on the map, let's discuss the different aspects of this map's geography. Each game space is classified into 4 types. First are normal territories. Second, the darker shaded territories are known as mountain territories. These give a bonus to the defender. The third type are normal and mountain territories with a city. These are simply referred to as city territories. City territories also give a bonus to the defender. However, this bonus does not stack if the mountain territory contains a city. It's the same bonus. Fourth and finally are invasion zones. There are 6 invasion zones each that border the US to the east, west, and south. Although these act as staging areas for the invader player, they can also be attacked and conquered by the American player. A key gameplay point to remember is that each space has a stacking limit of 5 units. Territories may also contain additional icons that define a natural resource such as agricultural, mineral, or oil. These icons were primarily used in the classic game to help track points to determine a winner amongst the invader players. Territory resources have a greater value in the new Invader variant that we'll look at a little later in the tutorial. Now let's look at some other features of the game map. At the top of the board is a U.S. turn track and a captured cities track. The U.S. turn track identifies the current round of play. If the U.S. player holds off the invader siege until turn 11, they win the game. Captured cities tracks the number of cities under control by the invader. The invaders collectively win the game if there are 18 or more city miniatures on the captured city track at the end of the U.S. player's turn. Now that we have a better understanding of the map's geography, let's go ahead and set up the game. In Step 1, each player chooses their forces. Fortress America requires one player to assume the role of America and 3 additional players to take the roles of the invaders. With less than 4 players, individuals may need to assume the role of multiple invader roles. For example, in a 3-player game, it is recommended that one player assume the role of the Western and Eastern invaders. In Step 2, players distribute components. Each invader player receives a total of 60 miniatures, control markers in their faction's color, and a reference sheet to aid with gameplay. The player in the role of America receives 60 green miniatures and 65 gray miniatures, targeting markers, and a reference sheet. The graveyard sheet and the deck of partisan cards are also placed near the American player. Now that we've got all the components out, in Step 3 we set up the map. First, let's start with America's setup. The American player places a city miniature over every city icon on the map. Next, he or she will place 60 green miniatures on the board. The player in the American role can place any 2 green miniatures in each of the 30 city territories. Next, let's set up each invader's first wave. Each invader player takes the following units of their color: 8 infantry units, 3 mobile units, 4 hover tanks, 3 helicopters, and 2 bombers. Each invader player then takes these units and distributes them throughout the 6 invasion zones. Each invasion zone is allowed a maximum of 5 units. After this, each invader should have 40 colored units waiting in reserve. Invader players also have the option that they do not need to place units in all invasion zones. Finally, place the turn marker on space 1 of the U.S. turn track at the top of the board. And with that, the game board is set up and we're ready to start learning to play the game. Now, let's take a look at the phases of gameplay. Fortress America is organized into a set order of play for each faction. The first player is the Western Invader. The second player is the Eastern Invader. The third player is the Southern Invader. And last, but certainly not least, is America. Each player will take a turn and play through the following 8 game phases. Phase 1 is Reinforcements. In this phase, each invader player adds 8 units to their invasion zones. The U.S. player places 1 laser unit and draws and resolves partisan cards. Phase 2, Declare Battles. In this phase, each player indicates territories they intend to conquer with control markers. Phase 3, Maneuvers, also known as First Movement. In this phase, players move units into battle position to prepare for combat. Phase 4, Fire Lasers. This phase is for the U.S. player only, in which they get to fire each of their laser units at the enemy. Phase 5, Combat. In this phase, battles are resolved that were declared in Phase 2. Phase 6, Invasion, also known as Second Movement. In this phase, each player moves units again to secure declared territories. Phase 7, Supply Check. This is for the invader players only. In this phase, each invader player checks his units to ensure there's an unbroken line of support back to the invasion zone. Phase 8, Capture Territories. In this phase, each player takes control of the new territories that they've conquered. Now, let's look at each of these phases in greater detail. During the first turn, each invader skips the reinforcement phase. The rationale is that the invaders have already stocked their invasion zones during setup. When the second round of phase begins, the reinforcement phase is active until the end of the game. Each invader has 6 zones to plan landings on American soil. Each reinforcement phase, they receive 8 units to place. However, they are limited to 5 units per zone. When devising a strategy as an invader, managing logistics is critical. Each invader has a total of 60 units. 20 are deployed during setup. 40 remain to be allocated to invasion zones, 8 per turn. The invader player can select any 8 of these units to fulfill their particular strategy. Be aware, once the invader has depleted all their reserves, he or she skips the reinforcement phase and must play the remainder of the game with the units they've deployed. Also be aware that the US player can push their forces into invasion zones to choke off invaders' options for deployment. Therefore, it's important to establish footholds early to protect your distribution channel into America. As for the US player, during this phase they add 1 laser unit to a city territory of their choice, and they draw and resolve 2 cards from the Partisan deck. The Partisan deck represents patriotic citizens that have organized to undermine the invaders. On the left is the classic 1986 version of the Partisan card. The tube television gives a current news story regarding the Partisans. The symbols on the right side of the card indicate which units to add to fulfill the story. On the right is the 2012 version of the Partisan card. This revised version provides the story text and explicit instructions how to resolve the card. The symbols now run along the bottom of the card for visual reference. Whichever version of the game you have, the US player will draw 2 of these Partisan cards from the deck and resolve them immediately in the reinforcement phase. The US player may also earn a Partisan card every time they retake an American territory. The US player first draws and resolves their normal reinforcement phase Partisan cards, and then the Partisan cards they earn for reclaiming territories. However, the US player can only place these Partisan units in a territory that meets at least one of the following placement requirements. The territory is considered friendly, or it is an unoccupied enemy territory. Partisan units cannot be placed in invasion zones, occupied enemy territory, or unoccupied enemy-controlled city territories. Now, let's look at the different territory statuses to get a better understanding of how this works. In Fortress America, the type of territory may enable or hinder certain actions. Therefore, it's important for us to understand the classifications of each territory. Territory types fall into 3 categories, each from the perspective of the US player or the invader. For the US player, an empty territory is always considered friendly. After all, it's the US of A. Why would we be hostile to each other? Well, unless it's election season. However, once an invader player has placed a control marker in a territory, that territory is considered enemy territory and must be liberated. A territory with only a control marker can be a little confusing at first. When the invader initially conquered a territory, it was occupied. There were forces there to place that marker. For various reasons, an invader may pull back his units, the units were bombed out of the territory, etc. The territory lost its military force. However, although it is unoccupied, it still needs American forces to move in and liberate the area to remove the control marker. For the invader player, the US is foreign soil. The only friendly territory is one with a control marker. American territory with or without military force are still considered enemy territory that must be conquered and a control token placed there to become friendly to the invader. Now, keep these rules in mind as we walk through the following gameplay examples. In Phase 2, players will mark territories to declare upcoming battles. The etiquette for declaring a battle is simple. When an invader wishes to declare a battle, they place a control marker with the battle side up in the selected territory. Once the battle is resolved, and if they win, they flip the marker to the control side. When the US player declares a battle, they take an existing control marker of an invader and flip it back to the battle side. This shows that they're going to try to take back a piece of America. Let's look at some maneuver examples. Now we know that when a control marker is placed battle side up in a territory, that territory becomes the area of a declared battle. When this happens, all adjacent territories to the declared battle area become potential battle positions. The purpose of the battle maneuver phase is to deploy any available units into these battle positions. Before we get too far into the weeds, it's time we properly categorize the game units for the phases ahead. Units are divided into 3 classes. Infantry and partisans are considered foot units. Mechanized units are comprised of mobile units and hover tanks. Finally, helicopters and bombers fill out the ranks of the air unit class. In regards to maneuvers, this is how these units perform and differentiate themselves. Infantry and partisans cannot move during the maneuvers phase. Mobile units and hover tanks can move into an adjacent space if it is friendly. Mobile units also have the ability to transport 1 infantry or 1 partisan with them as long as they all begin in the same space. Essentially, the foot unit hitches a ride. Air units are much more complicated. Helicopters have a range of 2 spaces. They also can fly over friendly or enemy territories. Bombers, much like helicopters, can also travel over friendly or enemy territories, but they have a range of 4 spaces. Each air unit has a special ability that can be very useful for taking positions or softening up units far behind enemy lines. Helicopters have the scouting ability. During the maneuver phase, a helicopter can scout into an enemy unoccupied territory to invade it. To scout, a territory must be declared and cannot be a city territory. Once scouted, the helicopter will remain in that territory for the remainder of that player's turn. To keep track of scouting abilities, helicopters are flipped upside down once they're in the declared territory. This reminds the player that they cannot be moved again during the second movement action in the invasion phase. Bombers have their own special ability. They can conduct bombing raids on enemy-occupied territories. Now, while bombers cannot invade and take over territories themselves, they can use their ability to remove units from them. When bombers conduct a bombing raid, they fly over enemy territories, occupied or unoccupied, to the declared bombing zone. Once at the target, they will conduct their bombing during the combat phase. Be aware that the bomber must be able to fly back and land in friendly territory with their 4 movements during the invasion phase. Keep these air unit special abilities in mind when you're planning out your operations. Lasers are an exclusive unit only available to the US player. In this phase, for each laser the US player has in the game, they can attempt to vaporize 1 unit anywhere on the map. To conduct this action, the US player places a targeting marker near the selected unit. He or she rolls a 10-sided die for each laser. If the die result is 5 or higher, the laser scores a hit and the targeted unit is removed. If the roll is 4 or less, the laser misses the target. In either case, once laser fire is resolved, the targeting markers return to the territory with the laser. This phase becomes more and more dangerous to the invaders over time as the US player picks up a laser unit every turn. The only way to disable a laser unit is for an invader player to take over the territory it's stationed in. Once this is accomplished, the laser unit is removed, and even if the US player retakes the territory, he cannot replace the laser. In Fortress America, the defender's units conduct combat first. The defender will roll dice for each unit class and resolve the results in the following order. The actual combat follows a specific order of battle. First, any air units involved get to roll their dice. Bombers get to roll a 10-sided die, and helicopters get to roll an 8-sided die. Next, mechanized units get their chance to roll dice. Mobile units roll a 6-sided die, and hover tanks roll an 8-sided die. Finally, foot units get their chance to roll. Infantry roll a 6-sided die. Partisans are a little more complicated. Partisans in groups of other partisans or other units roll a 6-sided dice. However, a single partisan by itself may roll an 8-sided dice. This represents the partisan's ability to blend in with the normal populace and then strike from within. The attacker units then respond with their own combat rolls. Following this, the battle is completed. Now, let's talk about dice. Classic Fortress America use numbered dice. The revised Fortress America uses dice with symbols. The good news is the dice are essentially the same. The numbers on the old dice correspond to the new symbols. First, let's go over the new symbols to understand their meaning. A circled explosion icon is a normal hit. The burst symbol is a combined arms hit, which in most cases is treated as a normal hit. However, if the defender is in a mountain or city territory or both, then it's considered a miss for the attacker, unless they have a unit from each class in the battle. The rationale is that cities and mountainous territory are much easier to defend than normal territory. Therefore, the defender gets a bonus. A blank die face is considered a miss. And an arrow icon indicates a retreat to friendly territory. When you compare these results to the old numbered system, you'll see that they're basically the same. A roll of 1 indicates a retreat, a roll of 2 to 4 is considered a miss, and a roll of 5 and above indicates a hit. When conducting combat, a player rolls a dice for each of their units and keeps track of the hits. Next, the player conducting combat gets to choose which units on the opponent's forces to be reduced as casualties. However, each unit that scored a hit must follow the order of casualties rules determined by their class. These rules can be easily checked on each player's reference sheet. Air units can choose any unit in the classes below them as a casualty. Mechanized units can only select units in their class or lower. Once units in these two classes have been eliminated, mechanized units can then take air units as casualties. Foot units must work their way up the classes. First, they can only select casualties from other foot units. Once the foot units are gone, they can take mechanized units as casualties. Then, once those units are depleted, they can finally take air units as casualties. Eliminated units are placed on the graveyard sheet for all players to witness. The graveyard sheet gives each player a running casualty report of how many units lost in the conflict. The invasion phase was originally known as second movement in the classic Fortress America game. Essentially, it follows the same rules as the maneuvers phase. The main difference is that now infantry units get to move. However, the main purpose of this phase, and probably why it was renamed, is to move units into territories cleared of units following battles. This phase can also be used to withdraw units like the bomber, or fortify territories by redistributing friendly units. During the supply check phase, each invader player must be able to draw a line of support from each of their units in America back to their own invasion zone. If an invader unit becomes cut off from his supply line, that unit is eliminated. An important note, invaders must draw a line to their own color of units. For example, the blue player cannot draw support from the red or yellow units or invasion zones. When combat ends, and the player's forces enter the declared battle area during the invasion phase, the captured territories phase quickly follows. In this phase, the victorious player flips the control marker from the battle side to the control side to formally capture the territory. The US player gets the honor of completely removing the control marker. The end of the US player's captured territories phase acts as a scorekeeping phase for the rest of the players. Cities are added or removed from the captured cities track at the top of the board, and the US turns marker is advanced to the next turn. All of this is meant to check for a US or invader victory before restarting the process over again with the first invader player. Now that we have a greater understanding of the phases of gameplay, let's review the conditions for declaring victory. The US player has 3 paths to victory. They win if they reach turn 11 on the US turn track. They win if they can eliminate all invader units, or they win if they can get the invaders to concede the game. For the invaders to win the game, they must capture and hold 18 cities through the end of the US player's turn. At that point, the invader players can either share their victory equally, or each player can add up their individual contributions for points to determine an ultimate invader victor. Points are scored as follows. Each captured city is worth 10 points. A captured laser is worth 5 points. And capturing a territory with a resource are worth 3 points each. Points are scored as follows. Each captured city is worth 10 points. A captured laser is worth 5 points. And capturing a territory with a resource are worth 3 points each. Now let's take a look at the invader variant added to the 2012 revised edition of Fortress America. The revised version of Fortress America comes with a cool invader variant that adds more advantages for the invader players to take down the US. The invader variant uses 3 foothold overlays for the game board and 3 decks of cards for the invaders. Each deck is comprised of 8 cards each. To integrate these components into the game, during setup, each invader shuffles his or her deck of invader cards and places them next to their play area, just like the US player does with their partisan cards. Then, during each reinforcement phase, the invader player has a choice. They can deploy 8 units from reserves to their reinforcement zones, in other words, the normal procedure, or they can deploy only 5 units and draw an invader card from their deck. The decision to delay 3 invader units grants that player a number of potential advantages from drawing the card. I'm going to show you 2 here to give you an idea, but the rest you can discover for yourself. The first is Reinforcements. This card allows an invader player to take 4 units from their graveyard sheet and place them back into their reserves. Once the card is used, it's discarded out of play unless the text specifies remains in play. However, to activate this one-time ability, a player must meet the prerequisites listed at the bottom of the card. In this case, the player must possess 2 territories with agricultural resources. The second card I'm going to show you is even more powerful. Each player has a card in their deck with a potential foothold ability. Footholds essentially give invader players a new invasion zone farther inland. However, the requirements to establish the foothold are steep. This Foothold Invader card, for New Shanghai, requires the invader to conquer Seattle, and they must also hold territories with each of the 3 resources. Once this is accomplished, the player can create New Shanghai and place the invader foothold overlay on the map. Just be aware that footholds are not permanent. If the US player recaptures the territory, the foothold is removed and the invader card is discarded. This is a great little variant that gives more meaning to conquering territories with natural resources than just in-game points. If you have access to a revised version of Fortress America, I recommend giving it a shot. And that wraps up our tutorial for Fortress America from Fantasy Flight Games and Milton Bradley's Game Master series. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial for Fortress America. I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.